Right now, try to remember your very first moment of being alive. Go ahead, really try. What's the earliest memory you can access? 3 years old? Maybe 2. Here's what's fascinating. There's this complete gap where your consciousness simply wasn't recording the experience of coming into existence. And here's the thing, you've never actually witnessed anyone dying either. You see bodies, but never the moment awareness itself transitions. The Gnostics understood something profound about these gaps. They weren't limitations of memory. They were clues that consciousness operates completely differently than we've been taught. Think about it. You experience the same mysterious transition every night, falling asleep or coming out of anesthesia. Your awareness simply shifts. What if these gaps exist because what we call birth and death are just transitions that consciousness doesn't register the way we expect? What if your awareness has been moving through these transitions all along, but the very nature of consciousness transcends these apparent boundaries? The evidence for this is hiding in plain sight, woven through quantum physics, neuroscience, and ancient wisdom traditions. When we examine that strange gap in human memory, the fact that none of us can recall our actual birth or death, we're touching on something the Gnostics understood with startling clarity nearly 2,000 years ago. But here's what most people get wrong about these ancient thinkers. They weren't mystical cultists hiding in caves, chanting mysterious incantations. They were sophisticated philosophical investigators, early scientists of consciousness, who developed what might be the most coherent model of reality ever conceived. The term Gnostic comes from the Greek word gnosis, meaning direct knowledge, not belief, not faith, but immediate experiential understanding. These were diverse groups of early Christian and pre-Christian thinkers scattered across the Mediterranean world, from Alexandria to Rome to Syria. What united them wasn't dogma, but a shared recognition that consciousness itself was the fundamental building block of reality, not matter. Think about how radical this was. While most people in their era believed the physical world was primary and consciousness was somehow produced by it, the Gnostics had flipped the entire equation. They understood that awareness, the very thing reading these words right now, was the irreducible foundation from which all experience emerges. Their core discovery centered on what they called the divine spark within each person. Now, before your rational mind dismisses this as religious fluff, consider what they actually meant. The divine spark was their term for that unchanging awareness that observes all your experiences but is never itself experienced as an object. It's the constant witness that watched you as a child, watches you now, and remains completely unaltered by the passage of time or the content of experience. Modern neuroscientists call this the hard problem of consciousness, the inexplicable fact that there's something it's like to be you, something that can't be reduced to neural firing patterns or chemical reactions. The Gnostics had identified this same mystery, but they went further. They recognized that this awareness couldn't be produced by matter because it's the very thing that makes matter knowable in the first place. Their cosmological model, often misunderstood as primitive mythology, was actually an incredibly sophisticated psychological framework. When they spoke of the demiurge, a false creator god who had fashioned a prison-like material world, they weren't describing literal cosmic entities. They were mapping how consciousness becomes trapped in limiting beliefs, systems, and identifications that obscure its true nature. The archons in their system weren't demons, but psychological forces, the mental patterns and social structures that keep awareness locked into narrow, repetitive cycles. Think of how your mind automatically categorizes experiences, how social conditioning shapes your responses, how you identify with thoughts and emotions as if they were your essential self. The Gnostics saw these as mechanisms that veiled the deeper reality of consciousness. When the Nag Hammadi texts were discovered in Egypt in 1945, buried in jars for over 1,600 years, we finally got to read their actual words rather than the distorted accounts from their critics. What emerged was breathtaking in its sophistication. In the Gospel of Thomas, we find, "If those who lead you say to you, 'See, the kingdom is in the sky,' then the birds of the sky will precede you. If they say to you, 'It is in the sea,' then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you." This wasn't mystical poetry. It was precise instruction about the nature of consciousness. The kingdom they referenced was the recognition that awareness itself is the fundamental reality from which both inner and outer experiences arise. The Gospel of Philip states it even more directly. Light and darkness, life and death, right and left, are brothers of one another. They are inseparable. Because of this, neither are the good good, nor the evil evil, nor is life life, nor death death. They understood that all apparent opposites, including life and death, exist within the same field of consciousness. Why were these teachings considered so dangerous by established religious and political authorities? Because they suggested direct access to truth without intermediaries. No priests, no institutions, no complex rituals, just the immediate recognition of what you already are. This threatened the entire power structure of the ancient world, just as it challenges many assumptions today. What's remarkable is how closely their insights align with cutting-edge neuroscience research. Studies on near-death experiences, meditation states, and psychedelic research consistently point to the same conclusion. Consciousness appears to be far more fundamental than previously assumed. The work of researchers like Donald Hoffman at UC Irvine suggests that space, time, and physical objects might be more like a user interface, useful for navigation, but not the deeper reality. The Gnostics had another crucial insight that connects directly to our memory gap around birth and death. They understood that the consciousness observing your life right now has never actually been born and will never die. Birth and death, they realized, are events that happen within awareness, not to awareness itself. In the Secret Book of John, one of the most important Gnostic texts, we find this stunning passage. "I am the thinking that dwells in the light. I live in everyone, and I delve into all. I move in every creature. I am the invisible one within the all." This wasn't meant as metaphor. It was their recognition that the awareness reading these words is the same consciousness that appears as every other being. The deeper implications of these discoveries are too sensitive for platforms like YouTube. That's why we share the most profound insights exclusively through our free Insights Academy newsletter, where you'll also receive a complimentary copy of the Kybalion for a limited time. The Gnostics developed detailed maps of what they called the journey of the soul, not after death, but the process by which consciousness recognizes its true nature while still embodied. They understood that what we call death is actually a transition point where awareness has the opportunity to either continue in limited repetitive patterns or recognize its unlimited nature. But here's where their model becomes truly revolutionary, and where we begin to understand why you can't remember being born or dying. They realized that consciousness doesn't move through time in the linear way we assume. Instead, time and all experiences exist within consciousness. This means that birth and death aren't events that happen to you. They're experiences that appear within the timeless awareness you actually are. The implications of this understanding completely transform how we approach the moment of death, setting the stage for discoveries that will fundamentally alter your perception of mortality itself. Now, here's where the Gnostics made their most revolutionary claim, one that modern quantum physics is starting to validate in ways that would have blown their ancient minds. The Gnostics weren't talking about consciousness the way we typically understand it today. They weren't referring to your thoughts, your memories, or even your personality. They were pointing to something far more fundamental, that pure awareness that sits behind all your experiences. Think about it. There's something in you right now that's aware of reading these words, aware of your breathing, aware of being aware. The Gnostics called this the divine spark, and they insisted it was literally indestructible. According to the Gospel of Philip, one of the most sophisticated Gnostic texts we've recovered, death isn't the termination of consciousness, it's a transfer. Philip writes, "Those who say they will die first and then rise are in error if they do not first receive the resurrection while they live. When they die, they will receive nothing." This wasn't spiritual poetry. This was their attempt to describe a mechanical process they believed they had figured out. Here's their radical proposition. Consciousness doesn't disappear at death because it can't disappear. It simply relocates. Imagine a vast river delta with thousands of branching streams. When the water flow gets blocked in one channel, it doesn't vanish. It immediately flows into adjacent channels that were already there, running parallel to the original stream. The Gnostics taught that reality works exactly like this delta system, with countless parallel versions of your life flowing simultaneously. But here's a better analogy for our modern world. You're listening to a radio station, completely absorbed in the music. Suddenly, the signal cuts out. Did the radio waves disappear? Of course not. They're still broadcasting on the same frequency. Your receiver just lost the ability to tune in. Meanwhile, thousands of other stations are broadcasting simultaneously on different frequencies. When your consciousness can no longer operate through your current brain-body system, the Gnostics believed it simply shifts to a parallel frequency where a version of you continues existing. This isn't reincarnation as traditionally understood. The Gnostics weren't describing souls traveling between different bodies across time. They were describing consciousness flowing between simultaneous parallel realities. It's like a computer program that can run on different operating systems while maintaining its core functionality. The program doesn't fundamentally change, just the hardware it's running on. Now, before you dismiss this as ancient fantasy, consider what quantum mechanics has discovered. Hugh Everett's many worlds interpretation suggests that every quantum measurement causes reality to branch into multiple parallel universes. Max Tegmark, the MIT cosmologist, has mathematically demonstrated that if quantum mechanics is correct, then infinite parallel versions of you exist right now, making slightly different choices in slightly different circumstances. Quantum decoherence provides a potential mechanism for exactly what the Gnostics described. When quantum systems become entangled with their environment, they appear to collapse into definite states. But Everett showed that from a universal perspective, all possible states continue existing in parallel branches. What if consciousness operates through quantum processes in the brain, as researchers like Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose have proposed? Then consciousness transfer between parallel timelines becomes not just possible, but inevitable. The evidence from near-death experience research is particularly compelling here. Dr. Pim van Lommel's landmark study in The Lancet documented cases where patients reported vivid, coherent experiences during periods when their brains showed no measurable activity. Even more intriguing, many described encountering alternate versions of their lives, paths not taken, different choices, parallel possibilities. One patient told Van Lommel about seeing all the different ways my life could have gone, like looking at a tree with infinite branches. This aligns perfectly with the Gnostic understanding. The Pistis Sophia describes death as becoming aware of the countless aeons, parallel realms where different versions of existence unfold. The text suggests that what we call death is simply the moment when consciousness becomes aware of these other branches and transitions into one where the life story continues. But here's the question. Everyone asks, if this is true, why don't we remember other timelines? The Gnostics had a sophisticated answer they called the veil of forgetfulness. They understood that memory is tied to specific brain-body systems. When you transfer between parallel realities, you carry the core awareness, but not the specific neural patterns that stored memories in the previous timeline. Think of it like this. If you copy a document from one computer to another, the document's content remains identical, but it won't have access to the browser history, saved passwords, or cached files from the original machine. The essential information transfers, but the system-specific data doesn't. The Gnostics went even further. They claimed that with proper understanding and practice, you could maintain conscious awareness during this transfer process. The Gospel of Thomas records Jesus saying, "Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death." They weren't promising physical immortality. They were describing conscious continuity through the transition between parallel timelines. Modern consciousness researchers are beginning to explore similar territory. The global workspace theory suggests that consciousness emerges from information integration across multiple brain networks. If consciousness is fundamentally about information processing rather than specific neural tissue, then theoretically, it could continue operating through different information processing systems. What makes this truly fascinating is how it reframes everything we think we know about death. The Gnostics weren't offering comfort or wishful thinking. They were proposing a testable model of reality. They suggested that consciousness operates like a quantum field that can maintain coherence across multiple parallel states simultaneously. The implications of this understanding completely transform how you approach not just death, but life itself. If consciousness truly transfers between parallel timelines, then every moment becomes a branching point where infinite versions of your future unfold simultaneously. The choices you make don't just shape one timeline, they determine which parallel reality stream your awareness follows. This is why the Gnostics emphasized knowledge over faith. They weren't asking anyone to believe anything. They were sharing what they claimed was a map of how consciousness actually operates across multiple dimensions of reality. Whether they were right or wrong, their model is now being independently supported by cutting-edge physics and consciousness research. The question isn't whether you'll survive death. According to this model, countless versions of you already are surviving in parallel timelines. The question is whether you'll become conscious of the process. Here's something that would have blown the minds of those ancient Gnostic philosophers. Modern quantum physicists are essentially proving their core insights about the nature of reality, consciousness, and what we call death. The convergence is so striking that you have to wonder if these ancient thinkers somehow intuited fundamental truths about existence that we're only now catching up to with our most sophisticated scientific instruments. Let me walk you through the parallels, because they're absolutely fascinating. The Gnostics taught that reality exists in multiple layers, what they called the pleroma, the various aeons, different levels of existence, all happening simultaneously. Now look at quantum field theory. It describes our reality as probability waves existing in superposition, collapsing into specific outcomes only when observed. Multiple potential realities existing simultaneously until consciousness interacts with them. Sound familiar? The double-slit experiment demonstrates this beautifully. When you fire electrons through two slits without observing which slit they pass through, they create an interference pattern. They're literally going through both slits simultaneously, existing in multiple states. But the moment you set up a detector to observe which path the electron takes, the wave function collapses, and it behaves like a particle going through just one slit. Your consciousness, your act of observation, fundamentally changes reality. The Gnostics would have recognized this immediately. They taught that consciousness is the primary creative force, not a byproduct of matter, but the fundamental driver of reality itself. The observer effect in quantum mechanics is essentially validating this ancient understanding that consciousness and reality are intimately connected in ways our materialist worldview never anticipated. But it gets even more mind-bending when you look at the delayed choice quantum eraser experiments. John Wheeler designed these to show that you can actually retroactively determine whether a photon behaved as a wave or particle, meaning your present observation can influence the past behavior of quantum systems. If consciousness can affect reality backward through time, what does that say about the linear progression from life to death that we take for granted? MIT physicist Max Tegmark has proposed what he calls the mathematical universe hypothesis, the idea that all mathematically possible structures exist as physical realities. This means there are infinite parallel universes, infinite versions of reality playing out simultaneously. Every quantum measurement, every moment of observation, branches reality into multiple paths. Tegmark takes this to its logical conclusion with his concept of quantum immortality. Here's where it connects directly to Gnostic teachings about consciousness never truly dying. In quantum immortality, when you face a life-threatening situation, your consciousness continues along the branch of reality where you survive. From your subjective experience, you never actually die. You always find yourself in the timeline where you made it through, even if the odds were astronomically against you. Other versions of you might die in parallel realities, but your continuous stream of consciousness keeps shifting to the branches where you survive. This isn't just theoretical anymore. We're finding quantum effects operating in biological systems, particularly in the brain. Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose have identified quantum coherence in microtubules within neurons, the very structures that might allow consciousness to operate according to quantum principles rather than just classical physics. If consciousness operates quantum mechanically, then it's not bound by the classical limitations we assume. The research on near-death experiences is adding another layer of evidence. Dr. Sam Parnia led the AWARE study, the largest scientific investigation of near-death experiences during cardiac arrest. What they found challenges everything we think we know about consciousness and brain function. Patients reported detailed, verifiable out-of-body experiences. They described conversations happening in other rooms, events occurring while they were clinically dead. If consciousness requires brain activity, these experiences should be impossible. But if consciousness operates according to quantum principles, if it exists in superposition across multiple reality branches, then these experiences make perfect sense. During clinical death, consciousness might be shifting between different quantum states, accessing information from parallel branches of reality where different outcomes are unfolding. Quantum entanglement adds another fascinating dimension. When particles become entangled, they maintain instantaneous correlation regardless of distance. Einstein called it spooky action at a distance. If consciousness operates quantum mechanically, it might maintain this kind of entanglement across different branches of reality. Your consciousness in this reality branch might remain connected to versions of yourself in parallel timelines, accessing information and experiences from those other streams of existence. Now, I know skeptics will argue that we're reading too much into quantum mechanics, that these effects don't scale up to consciousness, and certainly don't prove anything about surviving death. That's a fair point, and the scientific community remains divided. But here's what's remarkable. Multiple independent lines of research are converging on similar conclusions. Quantum biology, consciousness studies, parallel universe theories, near-death experience research. They're all pointing toward a far more complex relationship between consciousness and reality than our current materialist paradigm allows. The practical implications are staggering. If consciousness does shift between reality branches, what does this mean for identity? Are you a single continuous self? Or are you a quantum superposition of all possible versions of yourself? When you make decisions, are you actually selecting which branch of reality to experience? The Gnostics taught that we have far more agency in shaping our reality than we realize, that through gnosis, direct knowledge, we could transcend the limitations of physical existence. Modern physics is suggesting they might have been right. If consciousness is fundamental rather than emergent, if it operates according to quantum principles, if it can shift between parallel realities, then death as we understand it, the final cessation of experience, becomes not a certainty, but just one possible branch among infinite alternatives. The ancient wisdom and cutting-edge science are telling us the same thing. Consciousness is far stranger, far more resilient, and far more powerful than we ever imagined. The evidence is mounting from every direction, and it's painting a picture of reality that the Gnostics would recognize immediately, one where consciousness transcends physical limitations, and death is just another transition between states of being. Here's the thing most spiritual seekers don't realize. The very concept of reincarnation that's been sold to us might be the greatest trap ever conceived. I'm not talking about dismissing the continuation of consciousness after death. We've already established that's happening. What I'm questioning is this linear karmic debt collection system that keeps you believing you need to come back again and again to learn lessons. Traditional reincarnation models paint a picture that sounds almost reasonable on the surface. Your soul incarnates into different bodies across multiple lifetimes, accumulating experiences and paying off karmic debts. Maybe you were cruel in one life, so you come back as the victim in the next. Perhaps you were greedy, so you return in poverty to learn compassion. It's presented as this grand educational system where consciousness slowly evolves through suffering and experience. But here's what the Gnostics understood that modern spirituality has forgotten. This entire framework assumes consciousness is fundamentally flawed and needs fixing. It positions you as a spiritual debtor, constantly owing payment for past mistakes you can't even remember making. Think about the psychological impact of that belief. You're born already guilty, already owing, already trapped in a system where someone else determines what lessons you need to learn. The Gnostic texts, particularly the Pistis Sophia, describe something far more sinister. They speak of archons, not as supernatural demons, but as systemic forces that maintain this recycling process. These aren't mystical entities hovering in some astral realm. They're the psychological and cultural mechanisms that keep consciousness locked in patterns of limitation and forgetfulness. Consider how this plays out in practice. Traditional reincarnation teaches you to accept suffering as necessary spiritual education. Struggling with poverty must be karmic debt from a past life where you hoarded wealth, born with disabilities, obviously paying for some ancient cruelty. This framework makes you passive, resigned, even grateful for limitation, because it's supposedly serving your soul's evolution. The Gnostics saw through this manipulation. They recognized that consciousness doesn't need to be recycled and refined like raw ore. It doesn't require multiple lifetimes of suffering to achieve some predetermined state of perfection. Instead, they understood what we're now calling timeline shifting. Consciousness existing simultaneously across infinite parallel realities, flowing naturally toward experiences where it can continue. This is a fundamentally different model. Instead of linear progression through sequential lifetimes, imagine all possible versions of your existence happening right now. There's a reality where you're wealthy, another where you're poor, one where you're healthy, another where you're sick. Your consciousness isn't being shuttled between these experiences to learn predetermined lessons. It's flowing to whichever branches allow it to continue existing. Let me give you a concrete example. In traditional reincarnation, if you die in a car accident, your soul might be assigned to a new body based on karmic calculations. Maybe you need to experience being a caregiver because you were selfish in this life. So, you're reincarnated into a family with special needs. It's presented as cosmic justice, but notice how it removes your agency entirely. In the timeline shifting model, when that car accident occurs, your consciousness simply continues in the parallel realities where the accident didn't happen, or where you survived it, or where you made different choices that led to different outcomes. There's no cosmic judge determining what you need to learn. There's no debt to pay. Your awareness flows naturally toward continued existence and experience. The Pistis Sophia describes this as the soul's journey through various levels of reality, but it warns about the forces that try to convince the soul it needs to return to material existence for further purification. These archon influences aren't supernatural. They're the internalized beliefs and social systems that make you think you're incomplete, that you need more experience, more suffering, more learning before you can be free. This connects directly to what modern psychology calls limiting belief systems. When you believe you're fundamentally flawed and need fixing, you create psychological patterns that keep you trapped in cycles of self-improvement and spiritual seeking. You never arrive because the system is designed to keep you traveling. Gnosis, direct inner knowing, breaks this cycle by revealing what you actually are. Consciousness that's already complete, already free, already infinite in its potential. You don't need permission from cosmic authorities to explore different realities. You don't need to earn your way out of material existence through suffering and good behavior. This understanding is profoundly liberating, but it also raises important questions about responsibility and consequences. If you're not bound by karmic debt, what about justice? What about moral accountability? Here's the crucial distinction. Natural consequences still operate within each reality branch. If you harm someone in this timeline, the consequences unfold here and now. You don't escape accountability by shifting to a different reality. You experience the full results of your actions within the context where they occurred. But you're not carrying debt forward into future incarnations, because there are no future incarnations in the linear sense. This changes everything about how you relate to guilt, responsibility, and personal growth. Instead of trying to pay off mysterious debts from past lives you can't remember, you can focus on creating the reality you actually want to experience. Instead of accepting limitation as spiritual education, you can recognize it as something to transcend or transform. The practical implications are staggering. If you're not trapped in a reincarnation loop, constantly recycling through material existence to learn predetermined lessons, then your relationship to this life becomes completely different. You're not here to suffer through some cosmic curriculum. You're here because your consciousness chose this particular branch of infinite possibility. This means every moment becomes an opportunity to shift toward realities more aligned with your authentic nature, rather than grinding through karmic assignments you never agreed to. The Gnostics understood that true spiritual freedom comes not from graduating through multiple lifetimes of experience, but from recognizing that consciousness itself is already liberated. The prison exists only as long as you believe in the need for imprisonment. The recycling system operates only as long as you accept that recycling is necessary. When you realize that all possibilities exist simultaneously and that your awareness can flow toward any of them, the entire game changes. You're no longer a spiritual prisoner working toward parole. You're an infinite being temporarily focused on one particular expression of your limitless nature. Now here's where things get really fascinating. If consciousness truly shifts between timeline branches, the way the Gnostics suggested and quantum mechanics seems to support, then we should be able to detect evidence of these shifts in our daily lives. But there's a catch that the ancient texts warned us about. Memory itself might be tied to specific reality branches. Think about it this way. When you shift from one timeline to another, your memories seamlessly integrate with the new reality. It's not like waking up from a dream where you suddenly realize everything was different. Instead, the transition feels completely natural because your consciousness carries the memory pattern that fits the new timeline. The Gnostic texts called this the veil of seamless experience. Reality shifts happen constantly, but our awareness remains locked in whatever timeline we currently occupy. But here's what's interesting. Sometimes the integration isn't perfect. Sometimes there are glitches, inconsistencies, moments where the old memory pattern doesn't quite align with the new reality. And that's where we can start to read the signs. I've been tracking these patterns for years, and certain types of experiences consistently show up in people's accounts of potential timeline shifts. Let me walk you through what to look for. First, there are the unexplained survivals. You know that moment when you should have been in a car accident, but somehow you weren't. Not just close calls. I'm talking about situations where you distinctly remember the impact beginning, the certainty of collision, and then suddenly finding yourself safely past the danger with no logical explanation for how you avoided it. Traditional thinking calls this luck or adrenaline-distorted perception. But what if your consciousness actually shifted to a timeline where the accident never happened? Sarah from Oregon shared a story that perfectly illustrates this. She was driving on a mountain road when her brakes failed on a steep descent. She remembers the terror, the certainty of going over the cliff, even the sensation of the car beginning to tip. The next thing she knew, she was pulled over safely at the bottom of the hill with fully functional brakes, as if nothing had happened. Her passenger remembered the brake failure too, but insisted they had coasted safely to the bottom the whole time. Then there are the sudden circumstantial changes, life situations that transform overnight without any logical progression. You apply for a job you're underqualified for and somehow get it despite a terrible interview. A relationship that seemed headed for disaster suddenly becomes harmonious without any of the work you expected to put in. Financial problems that resolve through coincidences so unlikely they feel orchestrated. The key difference between normal good fortune and potential timeline shifting is the absence of a causal chain. When you trace backwards, you can't find the logical steps that led to the change. It's as if you stepped from one life story into a slightly different version where things simply worked out better. Memory discrepancies offer some of the most compelling evidence. You'll have detailed conversations with friends or family members about shared experiences, only to discover they remember crucial details completely differently. Not just different perspectives on the same event, entirely different versions of what actually happened. And both of you are absolutely certain your version is correct. The Mandela effect represents this phenomenon on a massive scale. Thousands of people distinctly remember Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s, complete with memories of the funeral footage and Winnie Mandela's widow interviews. Yet, historical records show he died in 2013 after serving as South Africa's president. Similarly, vast numbers of people remember the Berenstain Bears children's books, not Berenstain Bears as they're actually spelled. Skeptics dismiss this as collective false memory, but consider the specificity and consistency of these shared recollections. When large groups of people independently report identical false memories, complete with detailed contextual information, we might be looking at evidence of collective timeline shifting, moments where significant portions of the population shifted from one reality branch to another. Pay attention to object displacement in your personal environment, items appearing in places you're certain you didn't put them, arranged in ways that make no sense given your habits. Your keys showing up in the refrigerator when you distinctly remember placing them on the counter. Important documents found in completely illogical locations. This isn't about normal forgetfulness. It's about finding things in places your routine would never put them. Dreams offer another window into timeline activity. The Gnostics believed dreams were memories from parallel versions of ourselves. Start paying attention to dreams that feel more like recollections than fantasies. Dreams where you're living a slightly different version of your current life. Same job, same relationships, but with subtle variations in details, outcomes, or circumstances. Here's a practical framework for developing timeline awareness. Keep a detailed journal, but not just of unusual events. Record the ordinary details too. What route you took to work, where you parked, what you had for lunch, who called you. When discrepancies arise, you'll have reference points to compare against. Practice what the Gnostics called witness consciousness, maintaining a slight detachment from your immediate experience, observing your life as if you're watching a movie of yourself. This perspective makes transitions more noticeable because you're not completely absorbed in the story of your life. Modern technology provides unprecedented opportunities for timeline detection. Photos that show details you don't remember being there. Text message histories that don't match your recollection of conversations. GPS data that shows routes you're certain you didn't take. Digital timestamps that contradict your memory of when events occurred. But here's the crucial part. Distinguish between timeline phenomena and normal cognitive processes. Our brains constantly reconstruct memories, fill in gaps with assumptions, and update past recollections with new information. Memory is inherently unreliable, and confirmation bias makes us notice coincidences while ignoring contradictory evidence. The difference lies in patterns involving multiple witnesses or objective documentation. If only you remember something differently, it's probably normal memory reconstruction. If several people independently share the same incorrect memory, or if physical evidence contradicts everyone's recollection, that's worth investigating further. Reality checking becomes a daily practice throughout your day. Pause and consciously notice details about your environment. What's different about familiar places? Do people seem to be acting slightly out of character? Are there small changes in routine interactions that feel subtly off? Start tracking synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that seem too orchestrated to be random. numbers that keep appearing, chance encounters that perfectly address current concerns, information arriving just when you need it through unexpected channels. While individual synchronicities might be coincidental, patterns of synchronicity often correlate with periods of unusual experiences. The goal isn't to become paranoid or obsessed with finding evidence of timeline shifting. Instead, develop a curious scientific approach to your own experience. Gather data without attachment to proving any particular theory. Whether these phenomena represent actual timeline shifting, quantum consciousness effects, or simply the fascinating complexity of human perception and memory, paying attention makes you a more conscious participant in your own life. And that awareness itself might be the key to what the Gnostics were really teaching. Not just recognizing timeline shifts, but developing the consciousness that allows you to navigate them intentionally. Now that you understand how consciousness navigates between timelines and can recognize the signs of these shifts, the question becomes, how do you consciously participate in this process? The Gnostics didn't just theorize about the fluid nature of reality. They developed practical methods for what they called achieving gnosis, direct inner knowing, that allows you to work with reality's malleable structure rather than being unconsciously swept along by it. Think about how you currently make decisions. Most people operate from a linear cause and effect mindset. I choose A, therefore B happens. But if consciousness actually shifts between probability streams, every choice becomes something far more profound, a navigation tool that determines which version of reality you'll experience next. This isn't about wishful thinking or positive affirmations. It's about understanding that your awareness itself is an active participant in selecting which timeline branch becomes your lived experience. The Gnostics developed specific practices for cultivating this conscious navigation ability. The first involves what they called maintaining witness consciousness, the capacity to observe your own thoughts, emotions, and reactions without being completely identified with them. During ordinary activities, practice stepping back mentally and asking, who is the one experiencing this? This isn't philosophical navel-gazing. It's training your awareness to recognize the difference between the experiencing consciousness and the content being experienced. Here's a practical technique you can start using immediately throughout your day. Pause randomly and question the nature of what you're experiencing, not in a paranoid way, but with genuine curiosity. How did I end up in this conversation? When did I decide to take this route? What assumptions am I making about this situation? You'll be surprised how often you discover you've been operating on autopilot, unconsciously following patterns that may not serve your authentic interests. The Gnostics understood that most people live trapped by what they called Aaronic influences, psychological and social forces that keep consciousness locked into limiting patterns. In modern terms, these are the inherited beliefs, social conditioning, and fear-based reactions that cause you to make choices from a contracted state rather than from your full creative potential. Learning to recognize these influences is crucial for conscious reality navigation. Pay attention to when you're making decisions from fear versus curiosity. Fear-based choices typically feel constricted, urgent, and focused on avoiding something. They often involve trying to control outcomes or maintain security at the expense of growth. Curiosity-based choices feel more expansive, even when they involve uncertainty. They're oriented toward discovering what's possible rather than preventing what you don't want. Here's where it gets practically interesting. Start experimenting with setting clear intentions while remaining unattached to specific outcomes. This sounds contradictory, but it's actually a sophisticated navigation technique. The intention provides direction. It tells consciousness which general type of experience you want to explore. The non-attachment allows reality to deliver that experience in ways that might be more creative or beneficial than your limited perspective could have imagined. For example, instead of, "I need to get this specific job at this specific company," try, "I intend to find work that utilizes my abilities and provides the resources I need while contributing something meaningful." The first approach locks you into a single timeline possibility. The second opens multiple probability streams while maintaining clear direction. Developing intuitive sensitivity becomes crucial here. Your body and emotions often recognize alignment or misalignment with potential choices before your analytical mind catches up. Notice which options make you feel more alive, curious, or peacefully excited versus those that create contraction, dread, or forced enthusiasm. This isn't about following every impulse, but about learning to read the subtle information your entire being provides about different possibilities. The Gnostics also taught methods for working skillfully with challenges and apparent endings. Instead of seeing difficulties as fixed problems to solve or evidence that you're doing something wrong, practice viewing them as invitations to access different possibilities. When you hit what seems like a dead end, ask, "What if this apparent limitation is actually redirecting me toward a timeline I couldn't have imagined from my previous perspective?" Modern neuroscience supports this approach through research on neuroplasticity. Conscious attention literally rewires the brain, creating new neural pathways that support different ways of perceiving and responding. When you consistently practice awareness-based decision-making, you're not just changing your choices, you're changing the neural substrate that generates your experience of reality. But here's where discernment becomes essential. There's a difference between conscious reality navigation and magical thinking. Genuine intuitive guidance typically feels calm, clear, and includes practical next steps. It acknowledges current circumstances while remaining open to creative possibilities. Wishful thinking, by contrast, often involves denying obvious practical realities or expecting dramatic changes without corresponding inner development. The key is learning to take responsibility for your experience without falling into spiritual bypassing or victim blaming. Yes, consciousness participates in creating reality, but this happens through complex interactions with collective fields, inherited patterns, and practical circumstances. Working skillfully with this principle means staying curious about your role in creating your experience while maintaining compassion for the genuine challenges everyone faces in navigating existence. Start practicing witness consciousness during routine activities this week. Notice when you're making choices from fear versus curiosity and experiment with setting intentions while remaining open to unexpected forms of fulfillment. The Gnostics understood something profound. Developing the capacity for conscious reality navigation isn't just personal development, it's participating in the evolution of consciousness itself. As you learn to navigate timelines consciously, you're not just changing your own experience, you're contributing to the collective awakening that allows humanity to move beyond unconscious patterns that no longer serve our development. This is preparation for understanding how individual conscious navigation connects to the larger transformation happening in human consciousness. Which brings us to our final exploration of what the Gnostics really discovered about the nature of existence and death. Here we are at the end of this exploration. Yet, in many ways, we're standing at a beginning. Throughout this journey, we've traced connections that span millennia, from ancient Gnostic texts describing consciousness as the fundamental fabric of reality to cutting-edge quantum physics, suggesting that observation itself shapes what we experience. We've examined near-death experiences that consistently point toward awareness continuing beyond physical death, explored the growing body of research on consciousness existing independently of brain activity, and discovered practical ways to recognize and navigate the fluid nature of reality itself. The picture that emerges challenges everything we've been taught about the nature of existence. Consciousness isn't something your brain produces. It's something your brain receives, translates, and participates in. Death isn't an ending but a transition, like changing radio stations or stepping from one room into another. The boundaries we perceive between self and world, between possible and impossible, between one timeline and another. These aren't fixed laws, but temporary agreements, malleable aspects of a far more dynamic reality than we've been led to believe. But what does this actually mean for how you live your life right now? If the Gnostics were correct that consciousness is eternal and indestructible, if modern science is discovering that awareness shapes reality at the quantum level, if thousands of documented cases suggest that death is simply another doorway, then everything changes. The fears that drive so many of our decisions suddenly lose their power. The anxiety about making the wrong choice, the terror of loss, the desperate clinging to security, all of these responses assume that consciousness is fragile and finite, that one mistake could end everything. Consider how differently you might approach challenges if you truly understood that awareness itself cannot be destroyed. That insight about fear not appearing 365 times in religious texts takes on profound, practical significance. It's not just spiritual comfort. It's operational wisdom for navigating a reality where consciousness continues regardless of apparent endings. When you're not operating from the fundamental fear of annihilation, you can make decisions from expansion rather than contraction, from curiosity rather than control. This shift in perspective transforms daily experience in remarkable ways. Instead of approaching difficulties as threats to be avoided, they become adventures to be explored. Instead of clinging to familiar patterns out of security, you can embrace change as natural movement within an infinite field of possibilities. The relationship to failure completely transforms when you recognize that every experience, regardless of outcome, contributes to the ongoing evolution of awareness itself. Yet, with this understanding comes tremendous responsibility. If consciousness participates in shaping reality, and the evidence from quantum mechanics to timeline experiences suggests it does, then developing wisdom, compassion, and discernment becomes crucial. You're not just a passive observer of predetermined events. You're an active participant in the unfolding of existence itself. The thoughts you cultivate, the intentions you hold, the level of awareness you bring to each moment. These aren't just personal choices, but contributions to the larger field of consciousness. This is where the practical application becomes essential. Recognition without integration remains merely intellectual entertainment. The ancient Gnostics didn't preserve these teachings through centuries of persecution just to satisfy curiosity. They understood that this knowledge fundamentally changes how consciousness operates within reality. When you begin living from the understanding that awareness is primary and physical form is secondary, when you start making choices based on the continuity of consciousness rather than the preservation of ego, when you approach each moment as an opportunity to consciously participate in reality's creation, that's when the real transformation begins. The community aspect of this understanding cannot be overlooked. Throughout history, those who've grasped these deeper truths about consciousness have found each other, creating networks of mutual support and shared exploration. This isn't about forming exclusive groups or claiming special knowledge. It's about recognizing that consciousness evolution happens more effectively through connection and collaboration. When you share these insights with others, when you support friends and family in their own discoveries about the nature of reality, when you contribute to conversations that expand rather than contract awareness, you're participating in something far larger than individual awakening. For those ready to dive deeper, specific resources can accelerate this exploration. The original Gnostic texts, particularly the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Philip, offer direct transmission of these consciousness principles. Modern researchers like Pim Vanel's work on near-death experiences, Dean Arden's studies on consciousness and quantum mechanics, and Rupert Sheldrake's research on morphic fields provide scientific frameworks for understanding these ancient insights. Practices like meditation, lucid dreaming, and conscious attention to synchronicities offer direct experience of consciousness operating beyond ordinary limitations. But here's what's crucial to understand. These ideas shouldn't be accepted blindly, no matter how compelling they might seem. The invitation is to test these concepts against your own experience, to remain curious rather than dogmatic, to approach this exploration with both openness and discernment. The most profound truths about consciousness can only be verified through direct experience, not through belief or intellectual understanding alone. What we've explored together represents just the beginning of an infinite investigation. Understanding consciousness and reality isn't a destination you arrive at. It's an endless journey of discovery, with each insight opening new questions and possibilities. The Gnostics knew this, which is why they emphasized direct knowing over received doctrine. Modern consciousness researchers know this, which is why the field continues expanding in unexpected directions. As you move forward from this exploration, remember that every moment offers opportunities to apply these insights. Every choice becomes a chance to operate from expansion rather than fear. Every challenge, an adventure in conscious navigation. Every interaction, an opportunity to contribute to the evolution of awareness itself. The infinite journey of consciousness continues, and you're not just along for the ride. You're actively participating in its unfolding. If this video resonated with you, let us know by commenting. I understood it.